December 1944. The winter sun barely pierced the pale sky above Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where frost coated the barbed wire like glass filigree, and every exhale turned instantly to mist. Inside the fenced compound, the air smelled of damp earth and boiled coffee from the guardhouse stove. A line of German prisoners shuffled across the gravel yard, their greatcoats buttoned to the throat, eyes dulled by months of captivity. Then came the moment none could have imagined. An American sergeant, cheeks red from the cold, stepped forward carrying a crate of Coca-Cola. Bottles clinked softly against one another, their glass clouded by the chill, the brown liquid inside fizzing as caps were pried loose. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The sound psst of escaping carbonation sliced the silence sharper than a rifle crack. To men who had survived the retreat from Normandy, who had seen tanks burn and comrades buried beneath the rubble of Aachen, the gesture felt almost obscene. One prisoner, a corporal from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, later wrote that he thought it must be a trick. The enemy who crushed us now offered sweetness. In Germany, Coca-Cola had become a symbol of American decadence long before the war. A rare luxury whispered about in propaganda reels as proof of capitalist rot. Yet here it was, handed out freely in the middle of a global war that had stripped Europe to rations and dust. Some of the men refused the bottles, suspecting poison or mockery. Others waited until night, hiding under wool blankets to taste the alien drink in secret. The first sip shocked them, the sugar sharp against the tongue, the faint citrus cutting through the metallic air. For a moment, it felt like swallowing another world. Rumors spread through the barracks like wildfire that every American soldier was guaranteed access to Coca-Cola even in combat zones, that the factories never stopped, even as aluminum and rubber were rationed. It seemed impossible. In the Reich, every factory had been bent toward total war, steel, oil, munitions. But here, the enemy could wage war and make soda by the millions. The prisoners began to talk about it, with a mix of awe and resentment. How could a nation so rich in comfort also produce such overwhelming might? One guard joked that the Coca-Cola bottle was more American than the rifle, and to the men behind the wire, it didn't feel like a joke. It was a symbol of something terrifying, a society whose power was measured not only in tanks or bombers, but in the ability to make pleasure seem endless. That bittersweet taste, half envy, half disbelief, marked more than a small moment of cultural exchange. It revealed a truth about the modern war that no propaganda could disguise. Industry itself had become the battlefield. As the German prisoners traded their last cigarette for another sip, the question lingered among them, unspoken but heavy in the frozen air. How had America learned to turn even a drink into a weapon of morale and identity? The answer, as history would show, began long before the war ever reached Mississippi. It began in a divided world still pretending peace was possible. In the restless years between two world wars, Coca-Cola emerged as more than a soft drink. It was America in liquid form. By the mid-1930s, its curving glass silhouette was as familiar in Paris cafes as in Atlanta drugstores, and its promise of refreshment carried the aura of modernity itself. By 1938, the company boasted operations in more than 45 countries, a network that stretched from Panama to Palestine. In Europe, the nerve center was an unlikely one, Essen in the industrial heartland of Germany. There, beneath the smoke of Krupp steelworks and the tightening grip of Nazi power, the German subsidiary, Coca-Cola GmbH, thrived under the management of Max Keith, a shrewd businessman whose job required both loyalty and survival instincts. Keith understood his environment better than most foreign executives. The Coca-Cola logo, its red script bursting with American optimism, was a liability in a land where nationalism had turned militant. He adjusted quietly, emphasizing the drink's purity and efficiency rather than its foreign origins. The German advertisements traded Hollywood brightness for disciplined imagery, athletes, workers, soldiers. Bottling plants multiplied under his watch, from Vienna to Hamburg, and by the late 1930s, Coca-Cola was being served in Wehrmacht canteens as a symbol of vigor rather than decadence. The company's reach impressed the regime's bureaucrats. Its restraint kept it alive, but the Atlantic was growing wider in more ways than one. Across the ocean, executives in Atlanta and Washington read reports of Germany's rearmament with unease. When U.S. exports of Coca-Cola syrup began to falter in 1939, Severed by the tightening blockade and suspicion between governments, Keith faced a crisis. Without syrup from America, his empire would dry up. Resourceful and pragmatic, he turned inward, experimenting with whatever ingredients could be found inside the Reich's constricted economy. Citrus scraps, whey, and beet sugar became the base of a new concoction. Its name, drawn from the German word for imagination, fantasy, was shortened to Fanta. Born of scarcity, it became both a substitute and a symbol of adaptation under total war. Meanwhile, in Washington and the War Department's planning rooms, Coca-Cola's global machinery was seen with new eyes. It wasn't merely a beverage company. It was a model of supply chain genius, capable of moving perishable goods across continents with precision. To U.S. strategists, that logistical reach could be repurposed into something far greater. A morale weapon, a taste of home that could march with the troops. Thus, even before war formally began, the same product that had conquered peacetime markets was already being drafted into a new kind of service. When Europe erupted in September 1939, the world that had once been connected by a single bottle fractured overnight. In Germany, Max Keith fought to keep his factories alive under the shadow of the swastika. In America, the Coca-Cola Company prepared to follow the army to the farthest front. What had once been a drink of leisure was becoming an emblem of endurance, its bubbles carrying the story of an industrial age hurtling toward its reckoning. By the fall of 1939, Europe was burning. Cities dimmed their lights under blackout curtains. Steel convoys carved grey lines through the Atlantic, and a new kind of total war consumed everything in its path. Yet amid the thunder of artillery and the smell of oil and fear, another campaign was quietly taking shape. One fought not with rifles, but with glass bottles and syrup. In Atlanta, the Coca-Cola Company confronted a question no corporation had faced before. What did patriotism taste like? The answer came in 1940, when company president Robert Woodruff made his audacious pledge. Every American serviceman, he vowed, would have a bottle of Coke at 5 cents, wherever he is and whatever it costs. It was less a marketing slogan than a battle cry, a promise that comfort, identity, and morale would travel with the U.S. Army, no matter how far from home. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, that vow became part of official military logistics. The War Department understood what generals and psychologists already knew. Morale could move armies. To sustain that morale, Coca-Cola sent forth a new corps of specialists, the so-called technical observers. They were engineers and bottling experts dressed in khaki, dispatched to the front lines not to fight, but to build. Their mission, to bring America's favorite drink to the foxholes. Portable bottling plants, shipped in modular crates, followed the troop convoys across the Atlantic. Each compact unit could produce as many as 10,000 bottles a day, using local water filtered through field equipment and syrup shipped from the States. To soldiers slogging through North African sand or waiting out raids in Britain's damp barracks, that hiss of carbonation was more than refreshment. It was reassurance that the world they'd left behind still existed somewhere. Across the enemy lines, a very different experiment was underway. In Germany, Max Keith's once proud Coca-Cola GmbH had been completely severed from its American lifeline. Without access to imported syrup, he kept his plants alive through sheer ingenuity and rationed substitutes: whey, beet sugar, and apple fiber. Thus in 1940 Fanta was born, not as an innovation of plenty, but as an improvisation of desperation. It was a drink shaped by scarcity, its pale color and tart flavor reflecting a nation cut off from abundance. The contrast could not have been sharper. In the Allied world, Coca-Cola moved with tanks and paratroopers, a bottled emblem of mobility and industrial strength. In the Axis world, Fanta limped along, a symbol of isolation and austerity. When the Allies landed in North Africa in 1942, crates of Coke came ashore beside the ammunition and medical supplies. Soldiers joked that the drink was their liquid medal, proof that even in war America's assembly lines could deliver not only bullets, but bubbles. In that moment, the soft drink became something far harder, a quiet testament to a nation's will to supply both its armies and its ideals. The war of production had begun, and Coca-Cola was marching at its front. November 8, 1942. Dawn over the Algerian coast came grey and windless, the sea streaked with the silhouettes of American landing craft. Operation Torch had begun, the first great test of U.S. ground forces in the European theatre. From Algiers to Oran, the thunder of naval guns rolled inland, echoing against the Atlas foothills. The men of the 1st Armoured Division, weary from the crossing, disembarked into a new world of dust and sunlight, and into a campaign that would test not only their courage, but the strength of the American machine that sustained them. Behind the tanks, almost absurdly, came another convoy, crates of glass bottles, compressors, and syrup drums. Within days, the first mobile Coca-Cola bottling plants were set up on African soil. Beneath canvas awnings, technicians in army fatigues assembled the equipment, using desert water filtered through makeshift rigs. When the first hiss of carbonation rose above the camp noise, it marked more than refreshment. It marked the arrival of an industrial civilization at war. To the Germans and Italians facing them, it seemed unthinkable. The Afrika Korps had long since grown accustomed to scarcity. Ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley, margarine stiffened with sawdust, and honey stretched with saccharin. In the shimmering heat of Tunisia, the Americans' ability to drink soda, cold, effervescent, plentiful, was more than luxury. It was insult. Axis prisoners captured after the Kasserine Pass would later describe their astonishment at seeing enemy soldiers lounging beside jeeps, bottles glinting in the sun, as if the desert itself were an extension of a Chicago lunch counter. German intelligence reports filed from Rommel's own headquarters noted with grudging admiration the astonishing morale factor among U.S. troops, a spirit seemingly untouched by fatigue or shortage. They speculated that Coca-Cola and cigarettes were as vital as fuel in maintaining American endurance. As the North African campaign dragged on through the winter, the contrast widened. German supply convoys withered under Allied air attack, while American logistics expanded with mathematical precision, pipelines, depots, and motor pools blooming across the Sahara like arteries of steel. By spring 1943, Rommel's once-feared panzer divisions were starved of fuel and hope. The Americans, meanwhile, were flush with everything: rations, spare parts, and morale bottled by the thousands. When the final German formations laid down their arms in Tunisia that May, they faced not only superior numbers, but a new reality: an enemy who could fight with machines and with mirth. To the captured men, staring at the red Coca-Cola script painted beside stacks of ammunition crates, it was the most disorienting sight of all, a reminder that they had lost not just a battle, but the War of Plenty. June 6, 1944, Normandy. The morning broke beneath low-grey clouds and the endless roar of engines. From the beaches at Omaha to the cliffs above Pointe du Hoc, the air reeked of cordite, sea spray, and diesel fumes. As wave after wave of soldiers stormed ashore, few could have imagined that among the cargo pouring into France would be something as mundane, as defiantly civilian as Coca-Cola. Yet by that summer, the drink had become an inseparable companion to the American war effort, a bottled embodiment of home that moved with the precision of an army division. Between 1943 and 1945, the company's engineers, now woven into the fabric of the U.S. military, had built 64 bottling plants stretching from Iceland's freezing ports to Burma's steaming jungles. Each was an outpost of American industry, humming beside supply depots and airfields, filling tens of thousands of bottles each day. In the weeks after D-Day, the miracle of logistics rolled inland behind the Red Ball Express, the ceaseless convoys of trucks that kept Patton's and Bradley's armies alive. Among the fuel drums and crates of ammunition came boxes stamped with the familiar red script. At forward depots from Cherbourg to Saint-Lô, the first Coca-Cola bottles began to appear, clinking faintly amid the chaos. For the exhausted men of the 29th Infantry Division, fighting through hedgerows under artillery fire, that first bottle in July 1944 was almost dreamlike, cold, sweet, impossibly ordinary. In the ruins of Norman villages, where church spires stood shattered and air smelled of plaster and smoke, soldiers passed bottles between them as if to prove that normal life still existed somewhere beyond the front. To the Germans, the spectacle was incomprehensible. Captured intelligence reports and civilian testimonies mentioned Coca-Cola trucks following the American front, a rumor that spread disbelief through retreating Wehrmacht ranks. How could a nation, they wondered, pour such resources into trivial luxuries while fighting on so many fronts? In their own rations, real coffee had long since vanished, replaced by powdered chicory. Sugar was a memory, chocolate a fantasy. Yet for the Americans, abundance itself had become a weapon. Each sip a declaration that their factories and fields had not faltered under the strain of total war. As the Allies surged toward the Seine and beyond, Coca-Cola became part of the rhythm of advance. The red and white emblem painted on crates beside shells and medical kits. By the time American columns crossed the Rhine in early 1945, the drink had already preceded them, flowing into liberated cities as a kind of unofficial banner of occupation and relief. To the German civilians and prisoners who watched the bottles being unloaded from trucks, it seemed impossible that such sweetness could arrive amid so much ruin. Yet that was precisely the point, the taste of a world that could wage war and still afford to smile. Between 1943 and 1945, the war's tide brought an unexpected migration to American soil. Across the Atlantic came troop ships not filled with soldiers bound for battle, but with their enemies, German prisoners of war. Nearly 380,000 of them would cross the ocean under armed guard, disembarking at East Coast ports before being dispersed to more than 500 camps scattered across the United States. From the pine forests of Michigan to the cotton fields of Texas, many were veterans of elite formations, sun-scorched Afrika Korps infantry, Luftwaffe pilots, U-boat sailors. They arrived expecting hardship, barbed wire, hunger, punishment. Instead, they found a strange contradiction: a land untouched by bombing, an economy unbroken by war, and a people who seemed almost indifferent to their presence. The first impression was disorienting. Camp McCain in Mississippi and Camp Swift in Texas offered barracks with electric lights, canteens stocked with cigarettes, newspapers, and most astonishing of all, Coca-Cola. Prisoners could buy a bottle for a few cents, its glass cold to the touch, or receive one during breaks while laboring in the fields or lumber yards that surrounded the camps. For men who had watched Germany's home front wither under rationing, the sight bordered on absurd. Sugar, glass, fuel. Every resource in the Reich was reserved for war. Here even prisoners drank luxuries. How can they afford this? One captured sergeant reportedly muttered, staring at the label as if it were a taunt. The hiss of carbonation in a Mississippi summer felt like proof of something larger, that America's strength lay not only in its weapons, but in its unshaken prosperity. Censors struck out most references to these comforts from letters home, yet hints slipped through, descriptions of plentiful food, clean uniforms, and that peculiar American drink. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry scrambled to suppress such reports, fearing they would erode faith in the fatherland's endurance. But inside the wire, reality spoke louder than ideology. Some prisoners began collecting Coke caps as keepsakes, tiny trophies from a world that had never known scarcity. Among the men, the drink took on a symbolic weight far beyond its sweetness. It represented the unimaginable abundance of the enemy, the proof that the war they had fought for 1,000 years of supremacy had already been lost to a nation that could spare sugar for its captives. In those quiet years before repatriation, as the war's noise faded into memory, Coca-Cola became more than refreshment. It became revelation. Each bottle was a small effervescent reminder that defeat was not merely military but existential. For many of the men who returned to the ruins of post-war Germany, the taste lingered bright and bittersweet, like the memory of a world they had been told could not exist. Behind every bottle opened on a battlefield, there stood a machinery of staggering complexity and ambition. Coca-Cola's wartime miracle was not only about sweetness or morale, it was about industry, logistics, and the seamless fusion of civilian enterprise with military might. By 1942, the company's close coordination with the U.S. War Department had earned it a unique status. Coca-Cola was officially designated an essential war material. That label placed it alongside munitions and fuel in the hierarchy of necessity. While civilians faced rationing, measuring sugar by the spoonful and trading stamps for basics, Coca-Cola's syrup trains rolled unimpeded across the continent. It received priority rail transport, access to scarce materials, and the government's guarantee that the flow of sugar would never run dry. Between 1942 and 1945, More than 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola were produced for Allied troops, a figure that defied imagination. The scale depended on a miracle of mobility. Company engineers and army specialists collaborated to design compact bottling units that could be shipped anywhere and assembled in a matter of days. Within 10, a bare patch of ground near an airfield or supply depot could become a humming factory. The machines ran with mathematical precision, 120 bottles per minute, their carbonation systems whirring under canvas roofs, driven by portable generators and cooled with local water. At full capacity, each plant required fewer than 50 men, yet its output could quench the thirst of entire divisions. It was industrial minimalism transformed into morale weaponry, the American genius for standardization made manifest in glass and steel. Across the Atlantic, the contrast was devastating. By late 1944, Germany's industrial heart was collapsing under Allied bombardment. Synthetic fuel plants burned, transportation networks splintered, and even bread and potatoes became scarce. Civilian luxuries had vanished altogether. Chocolate and coffee survived only as memory. For German prisoners laboring in America's fields and factories, the steady hum of bottling lines nearby seemed almost supernatural. The rhythm of conveyors, the glint of clean glass, the endless hiss of carbonation. These were sounds of an empire of logistics, a democracy that fought its wars through abundance and organization rather than deprivation and command. What they had been taught to despise as decadence now revealed itself as efficiency perfected. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Coca-Cola had done more than follow the armies. It had outpaced them. Its bottling plants traced the advance of liberation from Algiers to Antwerp, leaving behind a ready-made industrial network that circled the globe. Within weeks, the same system that had supplied foxholes and airbases would pivot toward peace, turning the machinery of war production into the foundation of a new consumer empire. The transformation had already begun, carried forward on every bottle that had once been a weapon of morale and was now becoming the taste of victory. As American convoys carried Coca-Cola across the world's battlefronts, the Third Reich's beverage industry fought a quieter, more desperate campaign. By 1941, the flow of syrup from Atlanta to Germany had been severed entirely. The bottling plants that once fizzed with imported sweetness now stood silent, their gleaming machinery idle for lack of ingredients. Max Keith, head of Coca-Cola GmbH in Essen, faced an impossible choice. Let the brand collapse or invent something out of nothing. In a nation strangled by blockade, he turned to what scraps remained. Apple pomace from cider presses, whey from cheese production, and beet sugar from domestic crops became the raw material of a new improvised drink. It was named Fanta, from fantasy, the German word for imagination, but its creation owed more to necessity than inspiration. Bottled under the same roofs that once housed American equipment, Fanta became Germany's wartime stand-in for a vanished luxury. By 1943, despite rationing, Keith's factories produced nearly 3 million cases, most of them destined for Wehrmacht mess halls, worker canteens, and morale drives on the home front. Official propaganda framed it as a triumph of German ingenuity, a patriotic substitute born from self-reliance. Yet among soldiers the irony was bitter. War in a bottle, they called it, its pale hue and sour aftertaste a reflection of the times. Even its name became a quiet joke, a reminder that imagination was now all Germany could afford. For a people promised technological supremacy and boundless production, the daily reality was scarcity disguised in glass. When those same men were later captured and transported across the ocean, the memory of Fanta sharpened their disbelief. In the camps of Mississippi and Texas, the first taste of real Coca-Cola was almost hallucinatory, sweet, cold, alive with the fizz of an impossible world. It was a sensory revelation of defeat, proof that abundance could be real, and that the enemy's strength lay not only in arms, but in the invisible machinery of supply. In the aftermath of war, the irony deepened. Max Keith, who had kept the German branch alive through improvisation, was never punished as a collaborator. Instead, he was welcomed back into the global Coca-Cola system. Fanta, born from wartime desperation, was folded into the peacetime empire it had once replaced. The two drinks, one born of scarcity, the other of surplus, would coexist as symbols of a world forever divided and, at last, reunited by commerce. By 1944, the American military had come to understand something that modern psychologists would later quantify. Morale was a form of ammunition. Our soldiers' endurance, courage, and will to fight could be sustained not only by rations and rest, but by the smallest reminder of normal life. In that equation, Coca-Cola became more than a drink, it became therapy in a bottle. Field surveys conducted that year revealed that, for frontline troops, the three most valued comforts were cigarettes, mail from home, and Coca-Cola. Sugar, caffeine, and carbonation combined into a sensory spark that cut through fatigue and cold. The bottle's hiss, its glass clinking against another, became the soundtrack of a morale machine in motion. Decades after the guns fell silent, the memories of captivity still carried an unexpected flavor. In interviews conducted during the 1980s, aging German veterans, once soldiers of the Afrika Korps or the Luftwaffe, spoke less of battles and more of astonishment. They remembered not the moment of surrender, but the first hiss of carbonation in an American camp, the clink of glass against metal tables, the taste of Coca-Cola cutting through Mississippi heat. For many, that instant had marked a deeper revelation. Germany had not merely lost a war of weapons, it had lost a race toward modernity. The enemy's strength, they realized, was not only in its tanks or aircraft, but in its capacity to wage total war and still produce joy in abundance. Historians now see Coca-Cola as one of the century's quietest but most enduring weapons, a product that blurred the line between symbol and strategy. During the conflict, its factories mirrored the mobilization of an entire nation, where marketing, morale, and production fused into a single purpose. Every bottle produced for the front became a statement of industrial faith, that prosperity and victory were two sides of the same machine. In post-war analysis, scholars would trace this logic through the veins of globalization, the spread of American systems of supply, advertising, and aspiration that began not in peace, but in the crucible of 1940s warfare. For those who had once stared at the label in disbelief, that bottle remained a relic of revelation. In the deserts of Tunisia, the forests of Belgium, and the camps of Mississippi, Coca-Cola had stood as proof that comfort itself could be a weapon, that sweetness could defeat cynicism, and that morale could outlast artillery. As the 20th century unfolded, the lesson endured like the taste itself, familiar, effervescent, and quietly imperial. America's empire, it seemed, was built not only on steel and oil, but on sugar and belief. In the end, the story of Coca-Cola in World War II is not the story of a beverage, but of an idea America distilled into glass and sugar. For the German prisoners who first stared at those bottles behind barbed wire, the fizzing liquid represented something their world could not explain. It was the moment when ideology met its reflection and shattered. The myth of the disciplined, efficient Reich dissolving before the effortless abundance of a nation that could wage global war and still spare luxury. To historians, that encounter became a parable of systems. The triumph of freedom of production over the machinery of control, of morale over fear, of choice over compulsion. Decades later, when the veterans of both sides spoke of their memories, the battles had blurred. But the sensations remained vivid. The salt of sweat, the dust of defeat, the cold sweetness that seemed to come from another planet. That taste lingered not merely on the tongue but in history itself, as if each bubble carried the echo of a civilization's self-belief. Coca-Cola had become the quiet measure of power, proof that might could coexist with comfort, that a society's greatness could be seen in the things it gave freely, not the things it hoarded. From the roaring factories of Atlanta to the fenced camps of Mississippi, the bottle became a witness to transformation, a symbol of how the modern world remade itself, not through conquest but through consumption. The prisoners who once refused it later raised their glasses in peace, toasting the very drink that had once signified their defeat. And somewhere faint and eternal, that familiar hiss endures, the sound of history learning once again how to breathe.